The train hissed like a sleeping beast awakened. Steam coiled through the Gare de Lyon as a man in a tailored three-piece suit stepped onto the platform, a black leather briefcase gripped casually in his left hand. He didn't rush. He never rushed. His pace was confident but unhurried, like a man boarding a train he'd built himself. His name, at least today, was Count Victor Lustig. As the locomotive rumbled to life, the Count lit a cigarette and took one last look at the Paris skyline through the rising veil of soot and steam. Somewhere beyond the smoke, the Eiffel Tower stood tall in iron defiance, casting its shadow across a city still licking its wounds from the Great War. Victor gave it a parting nod, not in reverence but in amusement. He had just sold it, to a man who thought he was buying it for scrap. And the best part? No one even knew it yet. Just 2 days earlier, Lustig had sat in the ornate lounge of the Hôtel de Crillon, sipping espresso beneath a chandelier as heavy as his lies. He wore a carnation in his lapel and a forged government document in his briefcase, paper so convincing it could sway a minister or a millionaire. Around him, the city hummed with post-war uncertainty. Bureaucracy was a tangle. Corruption was a whisper behind every deal. Victor didn't just thrive in chaos, he engineered it. He'd summoned a group of iron magnates under the pretense of an exclusive government sale. He told them, confidentially of course, that the city could no longer afford the Eiffel Tower's maintenance. It would be quietly dismantled and sold for scrap. The chosen buyer would need discretion, influence, and a little something under the table. He had studied his marks like a stage director casting roles. One man stood out. André Poisson, an ambitious but insecure businessman, desperate to make his mark. To Poisson, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Victor knew exactly how to bait the hook. All it took was a fake contract, a carefully choreographed inspection of the tower, and just enough time for the check to clear. By the time Poisson realized he had been swindled, Lustig would be gone, vanished into the folds of Europe, a ghost in a monogrammed suit. But the brilliance of the con wasn't just in its execution. It was in the silence that followed. Poisson never reported the crime. Shame is the con man's accomplice. If no one admits they were fooled, there's no crime to investigate. And Victor Lustig, he wasn't just a thief, he was a psychologist, an illusionist, a mirror that showed men their greed and asked them to look away. As the train slipped out of the station, Victor took his seat in first class, folded his overcoat, and opened the Le Figaro newspaper. Page after page, and not a single mention of the Eiffel Tower. Good. He poured a measure of cognac from his flask, raised the glass to the window, and whispered, almost to himself, "The art is in the silence." He smiled, not because he had fooled a man, but because he had fooled a city, and it didn't even blink. They say he was born in 1890 in Hostine, a small town in what was then Austria-Hungary. But like everything else about him, even that is hard to pin down. The man the world would come to know as Victor Lustig entered the world as Robert Wojtek. Son of a respectable Czech family, his father was said to be the town mayor, or a bourgeois man of means, depending on which version of the story you believe. But young Robert was never interested in honest work. He didn't dream of a stable life, but of slipping through the cracks of one. Even as a boy, he had a face people trusted. He knew how to listen, how to mimic, how to disappear into a role. By the time he was a teenager, Robert was fluent in Czech, German, Hungarian, French, English, and Italian, a polyglot not for diplomacy, but for disguise. Language wasn't a tool for connection, it was a weapon of camouflage. In the early 1900s, he made his way to Vienna, the empire's glittering capital. It was a city of power, elegance, and desperate men with fortunes to lose. Here, Robert first learned the rules of the con. Let them think it was their idea. Never talk too much. Always be ready to vanish. Sell the dream, not the product. He started small, Card games, marked decks, rigged bets. But he didn't just cheat people, he charmed them. His eyes could smile while his mouth lied. If a deal went sour, he'd refund the money just to preserve the illusion. Every scam was practice, every escape a test. Somewhere along the way, accounts vary, he got into a knife fight over a woman or a crooked poker game. He was slashed across the left cheek, leaving a faint scar that ran like a comma from his cheekbone to jawline. Rather than hide it, he leaned into it. A duel, he once told a mistress in Paris, tracing the line with a finger. Over honor. I won. The truth? No one knows. But the scar gave him an edge, a story. Every good illusion needs a touch of darkness to feel real. The name Victor Lustig first appeared in continental police reports around 1910. It was a name that suggested Central European nobility. It sounded powerful, yet just obscure enough to slip past border guards and customs agents. He often paired it with a fabricated title, Count Victor Lustig. The title opened doors in Monte Carlo, Paris, Berlin, London. The Count carried a gold pocket watch, dressed impeccably, and tipped just enough to be remembered fondly, but never clearly. He created business cards in fine print, travelled with custom stationery, sent letters to himself from invented government offices so his mail always looked official. And above all, he kept moving. Train to ship, ship to train, never sleeping in the same hotel more than 2 nights. By 1914, just before the world tore itself apart in war, Victor had perfected a grift he would use for years, convincing the wealthy that he had a money printing machine, a device that could duplicate banknotes flawlessly. He'd demonstrate it in hotel suites under heavy curtains and artificial pressure. And it worked, because it didn't print money. It dispensed bills he had hidden inside it. The machine was fake. The illusion was not. When World War I broke out, the chaos gave Victor even more room to operate. Passports were forged, identities blurred. Nations focused on enemies, not swindlers. Victor moved freely between neutral countries, Switzerland, Spain, and the Americas, capitalizing on the fear and desperation that war always brings. He sold fake bonds, counterfeit stamps, impersonated war relief agents. Each time he vanished before the trap snapped shut. He had more aliases than I had socks, said a Secret Service agent years later. But every time I almost caught him, it was like chasing smoke. By the time peace returned to Europe, Victor Lustig was no longer just a grifter. He was an international phantom, a man with no fixed past and no certain future. The real genius wasn't the con itself, it was that no one really knew who he was. The Atlantic shimmered like melted silver beneath the hull of the SS France as Victor Lustig stepped onto American soil for the first time. The year was 1915. Europe was a battlefield, and America was still a land of opportunity, ripe for the right man with the right lie. Victor had both. He arrived with tailored suits, custom-engraved calling cards, and the most profitable lie he'd ever crafted, the Romanian money box. The device looked like something from a magician's workshop, an elegant wooden box with dials, gears, and slots. On the surface, it was said to duplicate any currency inserted, using a slow chemical process only Victor understood. He'd let the mark insert a genuine $100 bill. The machine would hum, click, and after a long suspenseful pause, out came another $100 note. Perfect, identical, real. Because it was real. Victor had loaded the box beforehand with matching notes, concealed in a hidden compartment. After the demonstration, he'd hand the box over for a staggering fee. Anywhere from $10,000 to $30,000, depending on the greed in the room. By the time the mark realized it was a fake, Victor would be on a different train, with a new name and a fresh carnation in his lapel. Victor wasn't just running scams, he was studying people. He learned to adjust his tone depending on the region. In New York, he played the sophisticated European investor. In Texas, he posed as a government agent with ties to Washington. In Chicago, he dropped hints of royalty, always with plausible deniability. He moved from city to city, staying just long enough to stir interest and disappear before suspicion could catch up. Every hotel suite became a stage, every conversation a test of character. And Victor was always the smartest man in the room. He never targeted the poor. Only the rich, the arrogant, the desperate for more. To Victor, greed was the ultimate weakness, and the easiest one to exploit. He once told an associate, "Let me tell you how to sell a man hope. First, you show him something he wants. Then you tell him he's clever enough to get it. After that, all you have to do is stay quiet and let him talk himself into handing over the money." It wasn't about stealing, it was about letting them give it to him. By 1920, his name had landed on the desks of a few Treasury agents. The Secret Service had intercepted reports of a smooth-talking foreigner peddling a money-duplicating device in major cities. But tracking him was nearly impossible. Victor used over 45 confirmed aliases across multiple countries. He forged documents so expertly that even real government agents accepted them without question. He used burner apartments, coded telegrams, and untraceable wire transfers. Whenever they got close, he'd disappear again, sometimes leaving behind nothing but an empty safe and a bottle of cologne. Sometime in the early 1920s, Victor privately shared a list with a fellow con man, a personal code he lived by. It would later be recovered by law enforcement after his arrest. Victor Lustig's 10 commandments for con men. Be a patient listener. It is this, not fast talking, that gets a con man his coups. Never look bored. Wait for the other person to reveal any political opinions, then agree with them. Let the other person reveal religious views, then have the same ones. Hint at sex talk, but don't follow it up unless the other fellow shows a strong interest. Never discuss illness, unless some special concern is shown. Never pry into a person's personal circumstances, they'll tell you all eventually. Never boast. Just let your importance be quietly obvious. Never be untidy, never get drunk. This was more than a creed. It was a blueprint. Victor didn't pull off cons because people were stupid. He pulled them off because he was invisible in plain sight. By 1922, the money box man had become a whispered legend in criminal circles. Even law enforcement spoke of him like a ghost. Seen in St. Louis one day, New Orleans the next, then gone. But Victor didn't just rely on illusion. He made allies, greased officials, hired lookalikes. He once staged a getaway by having 2 other men dressed identically to him board trains in opposite directions while he slipped out the back disguised as a porter. And he never stayed long enough for photographs to circulate. He was a phantom who traveled first class. Paris, 1925. The city still wore its scars like makeup, streets repaired, buildings repainted, but the wounds of war lingered in every anxious conversation and every bureaucrat's sigh. France was broke. Inflation nipped at the heels of the franc. Corruption ran high. Trust ran low. It was the perfect stage for Victor Lustig, and he had just written the play. The Eiffel Tower, once the pride of the 1889 World's Fair, had fallen out of favor. What had been an engineering marvel was now considered a rusting, expensive curiosity. Maintenance costs were astronomical. There were whispers in City Hall that it should be dismantled, but no one dared say it out loud. Victor, ever the opportunist, said it first. And more importantly, he said it on fake government letterhead. Lustig crafted a document that appeared to be from the Ministry of Post and Telegraphs, authorizing him to secure bids from private scrap dealers for the quiet sale of the Eiffel Tower. It was riddled with real bureaucratic jargon, signed by a forged official, and sealed with a fake embossed stamp that felt authentic under the fingers. He booked a suite at the lavish Hotel de Crillon, just steps from the Champs-Élysées. Then he mailed out official invitations, on government stationery, to 5 of the most prominent iron and salvage dealers in the city. The letter promised a lucrative, confidential deal, and all 5 men showed up. From the moment he entered the room, André Poisson stood out. He was newly wealthy, hungry for legitimacy, and nervous among the more established dealers. That insecurity made him vulnerable, and Victor smelled it like blood in the water. Lustig gave a grand presentation. He explained that due to public controversy and high maintenance costs, the Eiffel Tower was to be dismantled and sold discreetly for scrap. The government, he said, wanted to avoid public uproar by conducting the sale in private. He even arranged a private tour of the Eiffel Tower using forged passes and a hired chauffeur. The bidders walked beneath the iron arches like kings of ruin, measuring weight and value, while Victor spun them a tale of secrecy and state approval. But with Poisson, he played a different card: sympathy. Over coffee at a cafe after the tour, Victor leaned in and whispered, "Off the record, I live well. My government salary cannot sustain the life expected of a man in my position. Discretion is expensive. You understand." It was the bribe that sealed the deal, not the tower, not the profit. Poisson believed he was gaining an inside man, that he was clever enough to outmaneuver the others. He paid Victor 50,000 francs up front, and another 70,000 to grease the right palms. By the time Poisson went to City Hall to finalize the sale and discovered the entire deal was a fiction, Victor Lustig was already on a northbound train to Vienna, sipping champagne and reading Le Matin, which still bore no mention of his crime. But here's what made the con legendary. Poisson never reported it. Shame paralyzed him. A respected businessman couldn't admit he had been duped into buying a national monument. He'd bribed a man he thought was a government official. He couldn't risk exposure. Lustig hadn't just stolen money. He'd stolen Poisson's voice. There were no headlines, no police pursuit. Victor listened carefully over the following days. Nothing. The silence confirmed his next move. He would do it again. Weeks later, Lustig returned to Paris under a new name and repeated the process. New stationery, new forged credentials, new batch of scrap dealers. But this time, the mark hesitated. One of the bidders, suspicious of Victor's sudden push for speed and secrecy, quietly contacted the police. By the time Lustig realized the net was closing, he fled again, just hours ahead of an arrest warrant. The second attempt failed, but it didn't matter, because by then, the first had already made him immortal. The brilliance of the Eiffel Scam wasn't just in the paperwork or the fake meetings, it was in timing, psychology, and the illusion of authority. Victor knew Paris was vulnerable, bureaucracy was chaotic, and the more secret a deal felt, the more valuable it became to the mark. He didn't just forge documents, he forged reality. They crossed the Atlantic like a phantom trailing perfume and false documents. After the failed second Eiffel Scam, Victor Lustig vanished from Paris with barely a trace. The French police were too late. The newspapers never got wind of it, and the Eiffel Tower remained exactly where it was, minus one man's dignity and 100,000 francs. Victor resurfaced, as always, on his own terms. This time, he set his sights on America, a land not of laws, but of opportunity. When Lustig returned to the US in late 1925, the country was a carnival of jazz, bootleg liquor, and unchecked greed. Prohibition had turned ordinary men into criminals, and criminals into celebrities. Victor fit right in. He quickly fell back into the rhythm. Hotel rooms in Manhattan, suite numbers written in invisible ink, phone calls through switchboard girls he tipped handsomely. The Romanian money box was back in circulation, improved, polished, more theatrical than ever. But this time Victor didn't just target the rich, he went after the powerful. In Chicago, the underworld was ruled by one man, Alphonse Gabriel Capone. To most, Capone was untouchable. To Victor, he was a man with too much money and too little trust. Victor approached him with unusual confidence. He claimed he had a stock deal, a sure bet, but needed $50,000 in capital. Not to invest, but to prove his credibility to bankers who would only deal with men of means. Capone, always curious about a new angle, handed over the money, expecting it to be stolen. But 2 months later, Victor returned. Not only did he give the $50,000 back, He handed Capone an envelope containing $5,000 in interest. Capone blinked. "You're the first man I've met who didn't try to rob me," he said. And with that, Victor had earned something no one else in the criminal world had ever pulled off: Al Capone's trust. What Capone didn't know: Victor had kept the $50,000 in a safe, untouched the entire time. He never intended to invest it. The $5,000 he returned? From a completely separate scam run during the 2-month wait. Victor played the long con, not for profit, but for protection. Because now, no gangster would touch him. But not everyone was fooled. While Victor ran cons across New York, Chicago, Kansas City, and St. Louis, reports started piling up at the US Secret Service. Agents noticed patterns: phony bonds, fake currency machines, elegant men with foreign accents slipping in and out of high-end hotels. They gave the Phantom a name: the Count, and they assigned one man to bring him down: Agent Peter Rubano, a tireless investigator who had tracked forgers across state lines and considered con men the silent cancer of the economy. Rubano studied Lustig's trail like a detective watching footprints vanish into fog. Everywhere Victor went, money disappeared. But no one wanted to talk. The rich didn't want to admit they'd been conned. The gangsters didn't want their names tied to a foreigner. And the bankers, too embarrassed to admit they'd trusted the wrong man. In 1927, Victor shifted from machines to phony real estate deals. He sold non-existent hotels to gullible investors, sold bridges, fake oil fields, even a silent partnership in a non-existent Mexican bank. Each scam was short, sharp, theatrical, and each one added to the stack of arrest warrants piling up in different cities. Victor still wore carnations, still tipped bellboys, still greeted policemen like old friends, but the margin of error was shrinking. By 1928, Rubano had assembled a 100-page case file. Dozens of victims, false passports, accounts under fake names in 5 banks. He finally put a description to the Phantom: slim, European, late 30s, always in a hat, grey eyes, smiles often, doesn't blink. They issued a federal warrant. But Victor was already in New Orleans, scamming another banker with promises of rare European art. Victor once said, "The best trick is not escape, it's making them believe you were never there at all." He changed hotel aliases daily, used multiple tailors in different cities so no clerk could describe his clothes. He carried real passports and fake ones, and always made sure someone else in the lobby matched his appearance, just in case. At a party in Manhattan, he convinced an heiress he was a diplomat for Czechoslovakia. At another, he passed himself off as a retired count, bored with aristocracy. Victor Lustig didn't just con people out of their money. He conned them out of their reality. Every illusion, no matter how brilliant, relies on timing. And Victor Lustig was running out of time. By 1929, the American economy was teetering. And so was Victor's empire. The Romanian money box had dazzled for nearly a decade. But too many copies, too many victims, and too many whispers had finally reached the ears of men who didn't forget, and agents who didn't stop. The long con had become a ticking clock. One mark. A Texas sheriff named J.K. Gurley believed so deeply in the money box that he brought it home, locked the doors, and waited for the duplicate bills to roll out. When they didn't, he waited again. And again. After 3 days, the only thing that came out of the machine was nothing. Gurley didn't just feel embarrassed. He felt humiliated. And unlike Victor's usual marks, this one wore a badge. He alerted the Secret Service. And suddenly, the Romanian box wasn't an urban myth anymore. It was evidence. Agent Peter Rubano had been chasing Lustig for 4 years. Now he had what he needed: names, sworn statements, dollar amounts. The net tightened city by city. Banks were alerted, telegraphs were flagged, informants were paid. Rubano issued a nationwide bulletin. Arrest Victor Lustig, alias the Count. Passport check. Charges: fraud, counterfeiting, interstate crime. Consider highly intelligent. Do not trust charm. Do not delay arrest. Victor sensed the shift. Hotel managers who once greeted him with wine now seemed distracted. Postmen who once delivered his mail now asked questions. The air was thickening. It was time to vanish. On a rainy afternoon in New York City, Victor was picked up by federal agents as he exited a barber shop near Broadway. No disguise, no escape plan. They found $51,000 in counterfeit bills in his coat lining, another $8,000 in genuine cash in his shoe, several fake passports, a contact book full of aliases. He didn't resist. He smiled. At the arraignment, the judge asked if he understood the charges. Victor nodded and said, "I understand, Your Honor, but I don't agree." Held at the Federal Detention Center in Manhattan, Victor used charm and etiquette to manipulate guards, stall proceedings, and delay trial. He wrote letters in perfect script, gave away cigars, even played violin in the recreation room. He knew what he was facing: long-term federal prison, possibly Alcatraz. But he had one more trick to play. In September 1935, while being transferred from the detention center to federal court, Victor slipped out of handcuffs, leapt from a moving transport vehicle near 8th Avenue, and vanished into the crowd. The escape was so seamless, guards were unsure if he had even been there. For 28 days, Victor Lustig was gone. He fled to Pittsburgh, hiding under an alias, renting a small apartment, and forging new papers. He contacted old associates, trying to reassemble enough resources to disappear permanently. But one of those associates, feeling the pressure from law enforcement, turned him in. On October 20th, 1935, federal agents burst into a modest boarding house and arrested Victor Lustig for the second and final time. This time, he didn't smile. The trial was swift, the evidence overwhelming. He was convicted on multiple counts of fraud, counterfeiting, and interstate racketeering. The Romanian box was brought into court and opened in front of the jury. The illusion, his greatest creation, was shown to be an empty wooden trick. Victor watched without flinching. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he replied, "I regret only that I did not charge more." He had vanished from cities, slipped through trains, outrun agents, and fooled the world. But now, there was nowhere left to run. In 1935, Victor Lustig, conman, charmer, forger, escape artist, was sentenced to 20 years in Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. The man who once lived among chandeliers and champagne now faced the cold steel of America's most secure prison, a fortress for the worst of the worst: murderers, mob bosses, madmen, and now a man who had never fired a bullet, only twisted words into weapons. Alcatraz, perched in the middle of San Francisco Bay, was designed to be escape-proof. It was isolation, personified. As the boat approached the island, Victor stood calm. Hat gone, suit replaced by prison grey. No alias, no forged passport, just inmate number 300. But even behind bars, he remained in control of the game. He smiled at the guards, asked about their families, observed the routines. He wasn't planning a breakout. He was still studying the people around him, like a man watching a mark reveal themselves. In the mess hall, Victor dined with Al Capone, now stripped of his empire and ravaged by disease. The two barely spoke. Capone had no power here. But Victor still carried himself like a man with an exit strategy. Guards would later report that Lustig seemed oddly at ease in prison. He gave legal advice to other inmates, wrote letters to former contacts in perfect cursive, and somehow still managed to run cons from inside. One scheme involved writing to wealthy marks under an alias, posing as a wrongly accused inventor needing legal fees. Another time, he helped an inmate forge parole documents just for the intellectual challenge. Victor didn't need freedom to manipulate reality. He only needed pen, paper, and the right target. But time the one force he could never con began to catch up. By 1946, Victor had developed pneumonia, complicated by underlying health issues. His once sharp posture bent. His handwriting, still elegant, began to tremble. He continued writing daily, often quoting Voltaire, Machiavelli, or French poets. He reread books he once gave as gifts. He studied criminal psychology texts from the prison library, not as a criminal, but as a craftsman inspecting his own tools. There were no visitors, no family came, no headlines marked his decline. On March 11, 1947, Victor Lustig died in the prison hospital of Alcatraz at age 56. The cause? Complications from pneumonia. His death certificate listed his occupation simply as apprentice salesman. Even in death, he left a smirk behind. There was no estate, no final fortune, just stories. A few guards remembered him fondly. One reportedly said, "He never raised his voice, never lost his temper, just smiled and disappeared inside himself." Victor Lustig didn't kill. He didn't steal through force. He didn't break banks. He broke confidence. He understood something few others ever grasped. If you control what people believe, you control everything. He sold bridges he didn't own. He printed money that wasn't real. And he sold the Eiffel Tower because the world didn't see him coming. And when it did, he was already gone.